Prime Minister is coming to the end of his state visit to China. What will it have achieved and how will it enhance Sino-French relations? And a kindergarten in Japan has been accused of instilling nationalism and militarism among its 3 to 5-year-old pupils. What's behind the allegations and where will it lead? I'm Liu Xin. Welcome to The Point. As usual, we start with the world at a glance, and from America comes news that the US will not, after all, issue anti-dumping and countervailing duties on imports of truck and bus tires from China. The US International Trade Commission found in its investigation that American industry is not materially threatened by the imported tires. Previously, the US Department of Commerce had determined that the subsidized tires, so-called subsidized tires, were sold for less than their fair value. The negative findings from the ITC represented a rare outcome for the panel, and in the present climate of Donald Trump vowing to slap tariffs on Chinese goods, it was somewhat unexpected. China is by far the largest source of truck and bus tires imported into the US, accounting for over half of the 40 million truck tires imported into the US last year. Now, some tire importers were facing anti-dumping duties of over 20%. A spokesman for the China Manufacturers Alliance said anybody considering all the facts, including the record profits for American manufacturers and their inability to even come close to satisfying domestic truck and bus tire demand, would have to conclude that this was the right thing to do. To quote Warren Buffett, price is what you pay, value is what you get. Now, the Trump administration has rescinded guidance enacted by his previous President Barack Obama in favor of transgender students. Last May, Obama's Justice and Education departments instructed public schools to allow transgender students to use whichever bathroom corresponded to their gender identity. Though not legally binding, his order warned schools they could lose funding if they do not follow the guidelines. The directive sparked a backlash across the country, prompting legal challenges from 13 states. During his presidential campaign, Donald Trump said transgender students should be allowed to use whichever bathroom they feel is appropriate, but he reversed his stance after facing Republican criticism. Within the administration, it has threatened to become another distraction for him after a tumultuous first month in office. And it shows how Trump is bowing to pressure from the religious right and contradicting his own personal views. Surely toilets shouldn't be the issue. Transgender people just want to be average citizens and have the same worries everyone else has. When you roll out a progressive policy such as the issue, you need to take into consideration the opinions of the general public and the consequences the policy would cause. With such a controversial policy, it is surely better to take a cautious attitude than act too quickly, only then to have to roll it back, which then makes greater confusion and divisions within society. And finally, something much lighter. Astronomers have just announced an amazing discovery that has a monumental impact on life beyond Earth, a planetary system with a number of Earth-sized planets that could host liquid water and thus life. 3 of the planets lie in the star's habitable zone. That's the region surrounding a star in which liquid water could theoretically exist. This means that all 3 of these alien worlds may have entire oceans of water, dramatically increasing the possibility of life. The system is just 40 light years away. On a cosmic scale, that's right next door. But practically speaking, it would still take us hundreds of millions of years to get there with today's technology. But who knows if the technology of tomorrow could solve this inconvenience. One of the researchers at the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge have said, "We hope we will know if there is life there within the next decade." Answering the question, "Are we alone?" has been a top priority for astronomers, and finding so many planets like these for the first time is a remarkable step toward that goal. French Prime Minister Bernard Cazeneuve is nearing the end of his state visit to China earlier this week. During the three-day trip, Prime Minister Cazeneuve met Chinese President Xi Jinping, Premier Li Keqiang, and the chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, Zhang Dejiang. Besides Beijing, he also went to Wuhan in central China to visit several local French projects. Now, did the trip enhance Sino-French relationship? Joining me on the line is Professor Douglas Yates, a professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. Professor Yates, thank you for joining us. Now, as the first European leader to visit China in 2017, how do you look at the significance of Prime Minister Cazeneuve's visit to China?
Well, I think it's supposed to be interpreted as France's great openness towards China, that is, towards the government, towards the economy, and it's supposed to be understood as a positive gesture. However, there is a context. The fact that it's Bernard Cazeneuve, for example, is something of a surprise. The Prime Minister before, Manuel Valls, would have been the person who would have made this visit in what would have been perhaps a midterm of a long session for President Hollande. And instead what we have is a man who was appointed Prime Minister in sort of on the rebound, while Manuel Valls presented himself for the presidency. So the individual personality, Cazeneuve, is sort of a late night appointment, but the intention in terms of foreign policy is to send a clear message to China that France wants to retain its strong relationship with China.
Now, due to the uncertainty caused by US President Donald Trump's election win and Brexit, do you think it's an opportunity, although it's a last-minute late-night appointment, as you just mentioned, do you think it's an opportunity to develop a deeper Sino-French relationship?
Yes, and that is exactly the message that's being communicated. If the Prime Minister of France is traveling to China and making these visits, it's not really to inspect factories, but it's to send a message that this government of France is not protectionist. That is, the socialist government wants to distance itself from domestic politicians in France, like Marine Le Pen of the National Front, who's calling on a 3.5% tax on all imports on its right, or on its left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who wants to impose a carbon tax which would increase the cost of Chinese goods coming into France by the kilometer. So the current socialist government is sending a message to China, but it's also through intermestic politics sending a message back to France that trade with China is vital for the future of the French economy, and the real danger is protectionism.
Now, as we are going into the French election in 2 months' time, the question really is how big of a chance Marine Le Pen has in winning that election, and if she does win out in this election, what kind of challenges will it pose, you think, for China's relationship with France and with Europe in general?
The fears that right now are stirring the pot of ultranationalism in France, the fears sometimes take a Chinese face, sometimes they take an American face. But when the image of China coming into France being more wealthy, being a more dominant manufacturing country, having the ability to purchase emblematic French corporations like Accor Hotels or Club Med, when there's an image of China that can be caricaturized, Marine Le Pen can pursue policies that will in fact be destructive to France. So the idea of limiting Chinese investment out of the name of economic nationalism would in fact hurt French enterprises who desperately need more capital, which China is able to provide. The idea of imposing import taxes on China can only produce reciprocity. That is, the problem with imposing duties, with imposing tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, is eventually it's tit for tat. And in the end, everyone ends up paying for it. So the risk of Marine Le Pen coming to office for French-Chinese relations, economic relations, is grave. It's serious. despite the fact that both countries would be pursuing nationalism, they would be pursuing nationalism that was domestically oriented. And I doubt that China would adopt a policy of France first.
No, and I don't know whether China would adopt that kind of a nationalist policy here. But let's talk more on the economic side. We noticed that Chinese Premier and French Prime Minister discussed cooperation in some new fields this time, such as P4 Biosafety Lab, which is the Class 4 Pathogens Biosafety Lab, and Eco-City project in Wuhan in central China. What do you think of these breakthroughs? Have you been paying attention to such development?
Yeah, one of the problems had been in the past, say 10, 20 years ago, had been the sense that there were barriers against foreign direct investment, and that France often would draw a red line when it came to national champions in aerospace or in sensitive industries. And there was a feeling in France that French investments were blocked by requiring Chinese partners. And I think when we get cooperation in state-of-the-art technologies, it brings things to a new level because it builds confidence. The partners soon come to see they can cooperate in sensitive issues, that the Chinese can be a trusted partner of France, and France can be a trusted partner of China. So I find this is very positive. Of course, these are small issues, they're the first steps, but ultimately what we want is a greater integration and internationalization of manufacturing and scientific processes, where each country offered its comparative advantage. And China has numerous comparative advantages that it can offer to France. And France also, with its high tech, its specialization, its high level of education, its leadership in areas like robotics, has things to offer to China as well. And building the trust is good. And I think that's what a politician visiting can do, can establish a symbolic relationship on top of
especially on
investment.
Especially on the momentum that has been built by the high frequency of exchanges of top leaders between these two countries. Finally, let's talk briefly about Africa, because that is one continent that both China pay a lot of attention to, and France, of course. We have seen that the local people seem to have been trying to compete which model they would prefer, and growingly the French statistics show that African people are preferring the Chinese model of development. Is there a kind of competition between China and France in Africa, or you think this increased cooperation between these two nations can also help boost China and France's cooperation with African countries?
Well, okay, I don't want to equivocate, but there are aspects of both of those answers which would be correct. Let me start again with the fear, because you have right now a populist sentiment in France which is leading to ultranationalism that's widespread. So there's a fear in France that China is entering into its Africa. So there's a part of the African continent which is French-speaking. These were former French colonies. And France, even after decolonization, continued to dominate economically, politically, militarily, diplomatically. And so this area, sometimes called France-Afrique, or French Africa, is now menaced. In this fear, it's menaced by China's entry, and there's a word being used now, Chine-Afrique, which is a meme on that notion.
China-Africa,
the idea that China will come in and take over. Now, that's a fear. Now, the real planners, however, see nothing but opportunity. French Africa is deeply underinvested. It has tremendous needs for capital, for the kind of infrastructural development that China can offer. And so the ones who are planners are trying to take advantage of the French-Chinese relations and use France as a platform for Chinese investment in Africa. France happens to have $212 billion in renminbi, in Chinese currency, and French corporations are willing to use this Chinese currency counted for investment. And so France can become a safe place for investment with established financial markets, with large corporations, and in a way allowing China to pursue its adventure into Francophone Africa. I don't think they need France for Nigeria, for South Africa, for Ethiopia, for the Anglophone countries. But for Francophone Africa, I think France makes a cultural intermediary who could help a great deal.
Yeah, let's say China's cooperation collaboration with African country instead of a Chinese adventure. I don't know whether that is the most appropriate term, but anyway, thank you very much, Professor.
Excuse me, I only meant it, yeah,
it's okay. It's okay. Thank you very much, Professor Douglas Yates, joining us from Paris. And you have been watching The Point here on CGTN. We'll take a short break, and I'll be back right after that. A kindergarten in Japan has been accused of instilling nationalism and militarism in its 3 to 5-year-old pupils. The Tsukamoto kindergarten in Osaka is teaching pre-war ideals which are seen as a field for Japanese militarism. Among other things, in the mornings, the children are required to recite the pre-war imperial rescript on education, which was abolished from the education system following World War II. The imperial rescript is seen as a source of the obedience and moral certitude that helped fuel Japanese militarism. The action, once exposed, spurred fierce discussion among the Japanese media and anger and strong-worded questions from the Chinese people, of course. Now, hate speeches targeting Koreans and Chinese also have been seen in letters and statements from that kindergarten. Let's take a look at this video to see how the principal of this kindergarten explains the motivation.
What we are aiming to foster in education is patriotism or Japanesism, expanding Japan's spirit all over the world, not so-called nationalism. These are totally different things.
So I'm joined in the studio by Professor Su Hao from the China Foreign Affairs University and from Tokyo by Michael Cucek, adjunct professor of political science at Temple University, Japan, and adjunct professor of social science at Waseda University. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me in the studio, in the discussion today. How do you look at the nature of this curriculum? First of all, Mr. Su, let me come to you first. Is this patriotism, in the principal's words, or thinly disguised nationalism?
Well, yeah, I don't think it's so-called nationalism for its education in Japan. Actually, regarding this kind of their so-called imperial rescription and on education, which is original from the the World War, when the Japan's expanded itself to the East Asia. So this is some kind of their militarist education at that time, in the medieval time. So by this kind of education, so make the Japanese becomes the militarist, obeys the Japanese emperors to expand the Japanese missions to occupy the whole of the East Asia. So it is the vicious words for Japanese in its education.
Mm-hmm. Professor Cucek, let me come to you. What is your definition of the nature of this curriculum? Is that patriotism, as what the principal has said, or is it nationalism or militarism?
I would think that it would be best to be defined as useless, rather than either of those two words. Basically, this is a curriculum based upon a document that no one else follows in the country. Therefore, they're basically isolating themselves from the rest of the Japanese people. And in so doing, these children, who of course are not in any way responsible for the things that they say or repeat, are simply being burdened with an ideology that has no purpose in the 21st century. Whether you call it patriotism, call it nationalism, is partially irrelevant. Largely, the imperial rescript is mostly a Confucian document. 9/10 of it is pure Confucianism. It's only the last part where it asks people to give up their lives in the service of the emperor if the emperor calls them. That's what everyone objects to, and certainly most of Japanese today look at that as an anachronism that has no purpose.
Well, were you surprised to find this kind of education in kindergarten, especially for 3- and 5-year-olds? And it is said that this practice has been in place since 2001.
The Tsukumoto Yochien, the kindergarten, is, according to its own claims, the oldest kindergarten in Japan. But even the right-wing Sankei Shimbun here calls it extremely unique. And it is. Most people have never heard of this place, cannot even believe that it exists. And it's only come to the fore because it is now building an elementary school, and that elementary school has as its honorary principal the wife of the Prime Minister, Akie Abe, who is Prime Minister Abe's spouse. That has suddenly raised awareness of this place, which for many, many decades was operating in this way with no one paying attention to it at all.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is the particular dangerous part of it, that this has been happening for such a long time. Mr. Su, let me come to you. What is your reaction upon hearing such incident in Japan, that it has been happening for so long without people paying attention to it, and its link to the wife of the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe?
Yeah, when I heard this news regarding the kind of the ridiculous behaviors in this education, I'm very surprised. At the moment we are already in the 21st century, and we're already after the World War, not only the World War II, but also the end of the Cold War. So we are on a globalized, situation at the moment. So China and Japan, even though we have some kind of problem in historical issue, but both sides already cooperated with each other in the regional integration and for the regional community building. But in this kind of the process, now in Japan, there's some kind of the negative elements still existed within the Japanese educational system. So it's a very bad word for for this kind of the current newly international society. So it's bad news.
And something else which has caused a lot of unease here in China is that the pupils in the kindergarten have been long exposed to repeated criticism or discrimination of Korea and China in public statements. For instance, the kindergarten described Korean residents and Chinese people as those with quote-unquote wicked ideas, calling the latter shinaji, which is a derogatory term for Chinese people. Now, when confronted, the kindergarten apologized on its website, and it's in a manner that if you don't pay attention, you don't really notice. The kindergarten apologized, but only for using expressions that could cause misunderstanding, and said the school will continue to fight against spiteful criticism. Professor Cucek, what do you think of this kind of very strong hate speech and this kind of apology that really is not sorry at all about what they're doing, in my opinion?
Well, the matter of the hate speech in this case, the use of derogatory terms, is part and parcel with the basic ideology of really a single individual who is the director, the principal of this, this kindergarten, who wants to start now an elementary school. He is, yes, a member of the very famous Nippon Kaigi, Japan Conference organization, which the Prime Minister is also a member of, as is Koike Yuriko, the governor of Tokyo, this so-called secret society that promotes patriotism and Shinto worship. Yes, he is the Osaka chapter member and has had contact with the wife of the Prime Minister, and she has in fact visited this daycare center slash kindergarten. This is really something that has been very, very shocking to a lot of people, that the Abes, who have been in politics for decades, are so unsophisticated and so trusting to go and get involved with this very marginal person. This is a person who believes things that are isolating the children at his school from, again, the globalized world. What company will hire people who hate Koreans and Chinese? No one. There's no place for them in the future. So this is a backwater. This is a dead end for these children. And it's really amazing that Mr. Abe and Mrs. Abe somehow stumbled and got involved with this man.
Finally, let me come to you, Professor Mr. Su. How do you see the fundamental reason behind the existence of such a kindergarten and people who want to teach young kids such useless ideology? Is that, what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, as we know, recent years in Japan, the right wing becomes more and more obvious and active in the Japanese society. And with the kind of political background, so Japanese government, in particular some Japanese right-wing politicians like Shinzo Abe become the prime minister. So he has a very strong ambition to be, their pioneer for Japanese new political phenomena, to reform the Japanese constitution and make Japan more and more military orientation, and make Japan has more ambition within the region of East Asia to take so-called Japanese, the head within the region, to take place of China. So that's real, the problematic situation in Japan.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. We have to leave it there. You have been watching The Point. My last point is coming right up. Teaching anyone to hate other people is wrong, whatever your or their nationality. But when it involves preschool kids, it is especially dangerous. By all means, teach children to love their country, but growing up with an instinctive dislike of one's fellow man is an unhealthy attitude that can only backfire in the future. The world surely has too much hatred as it is. Let's not stoke up the fire to make things even worse for future generations. That's it for this edition of The Point. Thank you for watching. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time.